Okay, so welcome to our positivity bias class. This is chapter 23, and this is an important chapter because, it's one thing to talk the talk, but can you actually walk the talk? Can you actually live that? And that can be much, much more challenging. And I think that's one of the reasons why when someone has a specific challenge to go through, they seek others who have been through that journey before to talk with. So victims of crime or victims of health issues, they always want to talk with someone else who's been through it before. Some of those can be major. I will tell you this, since it's all men over 50 plus a nurse who gets it. I did have someone who was talking to me earlier this week about an annual visit that men have.
I get it.
And the challenges. So I Googled. I remember that Robin Williams had done a routine on a colonoscopy, and so I couldn't remember the details. So I wrote down comedy and colonoscopy, and I learned something. Every male comedian over 50 has a routine on colonoscopy.
I wonder why.
And they're pretty funny.
No, you don't have to have one if you're under a certain risk level, because there's an at-home test that you could do.
Dave, that's not the point.
Oh. Well, it is if you're a comedian.
No, it
isn't. Bottom line is that when we're in a challenge or facing a challenge, we oftentimes want to speak with someone who's been there and done that and can encourage us through the difficulties. And, so it's one thing to talk about the Rebbe's positivity bias in times of relative peace. But how did he behave while he was under Nazi Germany? So in other words, this chapter begins with a concept that in 1941, the Rebbe escaped Europe to join his father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, in New York. But prior to the immigration, the Rebbe and his wife, they lived in France as the German expansion across the continent was taking place. And during this tense and turbulent time, the Rebbe had many encounters, and as we hear the stories about those encounters, we get an insider picture into who the Rebbe was in those years before he had the mantle of leadership. And there's a letter that's actually dated the third night of Hanukkah from 1944, where the Rebbe was actually writing a response to a wartime acquaintance of his. Now, by this time, he's already living in Brooklyn, New York, but he's writing to someone he knew back in Europe. And he says, "Your letter awakened memories of the time we were together in Vichy and Nice under difficult and alien conditions. From a time when a person is uprooted from his habitual environment until he grows accustomed to the demands and conditions of his new place. In this interim, there come to light certain traits of his inner character as they are in their purity, undistorted by the expectations of society. Often these traits reveal hidden virtues of this person, virtues that may have been hidden even from himself under the layers of manners and the social conventions. Fortunate is the person who does not allow these traits to disappear when he subsequently settles down and finds tranquility." So the Rebbe is reflecting back to this gentleman that those things that we learned about ourselves under the most stressful situations, we shouldn't forget those things. We should track those things and hang on to the good ones, right? So that was what was the Rebbe telling a friend of his from 1944? In 1944, he was reflecting that. So now we keep that in mind when we start hearing stories about the Rebbe during those years. So the unexpected obstacles, the emergencies, they bring out the best and the worst of people, right? And so we look at some of the stories of the Rebbe during those very challenging times to see how he was able to get through those times, right? And what we see is the essence of very profound faith and an absolute insight into divine providence, the opportunities that someone receives at a time. So in 1933, shortly after the Nazis assumed power in Germany, they moved from Berlin to Paris. The Rebbe and his wife, they moved to Paris. In June of 1940, they fled Paris under the German invasion, and they traveled to Vichy, France, in the southern area. And even that was only relatively safe, because no one's truly safe at the time. But the hotels were inundated with all these people, these refugees, trying to get away from the oncoming onslaught. And so the hotels would not allow a person to even come in to look for a room if they couldn't prove that they could afford it. The story is that the Rebbe had one $100 bill, and he went out to the crowds in the street, found a family looking in distress, told them come to his hotel. He would hand them the $100 bill and tell them what his room number is. They would go in, prove that they can afford this, get a hotel room, and then they would go up to his room and return the $100 bill. And then he went right back out to the crowd to find another Jewish family in distress. And so one family after another, he was able to turn around and be able to support and help, knowing full well that if he got caught, it wouldn't be pretty. But you see that opportunity to help someone, that opportunity to save someone in distress, he just kept going for it one time after another, right? Now, there came a time when even in southern France, the French rule came out under the Nazi regime. The Vichy government at that time was a puppet to the Nazi government, and everyone had to report to the government and give their name, their location, and their religion, which basically was a means by which they could easily gather up the Jews when the time came. And when Rabbi Lieberman, Yehuda Ari Lieberman, he went with the Rebbe to go register. And the guy at registration looked up at the Rebbe and he wrote down religious. That's all he wrote down. The Rebbe didn't say anything. The guy just wrote down religious. The Rebbe could have walked away, but the Rebbe would not disconnect from his people and his God for even a moment. And he told him, write down religious Jew, Jewish religious. He wanted it on the record. Obviously, that puts him at greater danger, but it was an example of how he refused to be in any way separated from his essence, his people, and his God, even under penalty of potential danger. There's Reb David Aaron Newman tells a story. They live in Williamsburg now, but he talks about when he was orphaned, or at least he wasn't sure, but there were a lot of small children that were sent to orphanages. Some were orphans already; they knew they'd lost their parents. Others did not, but he was in an orphanage in southern France and in Marseille, and there are a lot of obviously distraught children, little children, 30 or 40 kids there, and often crying for their parents because they were gone, or crying for their parents because they didn't know where they were, but small children. And oftentimes there was no food. Beginning of the summer, he recalls Newman recalls that in the beginning of the summer of 1941, a man came to the orphanage. They never knew his name. They just called him Monsieur, which is Mr., right? And every day, Monsieur would arrive with bags of bread, French baguettes, tuna, sardines, potatoes sometimes, and he stayed until he was sure that every child had eaten. And sometimes there were kids who didn't want to eat. They were just too distraught. And he would literally sit down with them and make sure they ate, either distract them with stories or other things to get them to eat, making sure that every child would eat. And this literally went on for months. And he became like a father figure for these orphans. And at some point, the war was over, and some of the parents did come back and they did collect their kids. And this Newman was reunited with his parents, and eventually they left Europe and they came to America. They were living in New York, and in 1957, his uncle suggested, let's go visit the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So he said, sure. His uncle was going to take him, go visit. So they went, and they waited in line to meet the Rebbe, late appointments late at night. And when they finally had an opportunity to walk in to visit the Rebbe looked up at Rabbi Newman, and he smiled and he said, "Oh, this is Davido. This is my David, my little David." And Newman thought, like, how does he know me? And then it dawned on him. He recognized, this is Monsignor. This is the one who kept him alive in the orphanage. And he recognized, David changed, obviously, in the last 15, 20 years, right? Well, they both did, but how much more so from a child? It says in Chumash that when the brothers had sold Joseph into slavery, right? By the time they see him in Egypt, he's not a kid anymore. He's an adult. He's got a full beard. He has children. He's speaking a different language, and he's in a different location. So they could not recognize him. He could recognize them, but they could not recognize him. Here you see that the Rebbe recognized Davido. He's now an adult and in a new world and everything else. But even before, David recognized the gentleman they only knew as Monsignor, the one who helped them survive in the worst of those last years of the war. And so it's kind of amazing to think about how he was able to keep track of all the people he'd met all over the years, even as they'd grown. So it was a very, very special thing. So these are just some of the stories. There's many, many more stories, but these are some of the stories that give us an insight into, in the worst of situations, how a person can find within his sphere of influence what he can do to make life better for other people, to make a little bit of goodness and kindness in the world. And so in the worst of times, we saw that Rebbe did that, and it continued to be a theme throughout all of the Rebbe's life. So it's not unusual or unexpected that we find in the last half century of the Rebbe's life, he was focused on positivity and always finding the good in any situation, finding the opportunity in any situation, using his sphere of influence to try and make things better for all the people around him. And again, so that becomes our mandate, our marching orders, if you would, that within our sphere of influence, what we can do, even under the worst circumstances, we must do to try and make this world a better place for the people around us.